Well, hello, everybody. We will wait for a couple of minutes while people sign up, but welcome to our webinar on designing a world-class hiring intake process. And for someone who truly understands the word world-class, I'm joined here today by James Hudson, who's run recruiting at some of the largest and most recognizable brands, has done everything possible at TA. James, thank you for being here.
You're so welcome, and no pressure with that introduction. Really happy to be here, and I'll do my best to share some knowledge.
Oh, I'm sure you'll do more than that, James. James, one of the things you mentioned in your bio is your alt life. You are a traveling chef. You would like to be a traveling chef. What's your favorite?
Yes.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
I cook like lots of different cuisines. It's like my therapy and my decompression. Like with a job like mine, when you're talking and hopefully listening in equal measure all day long, I just really like complete silence. After I would say when I get home, but we all work at home now. Complete silence at the end of my day, and I just like chopping and stirring and like staring into the middle distance for an hour. I find like super therapeutic, and I'm a great believer in taking career breaks. I like to take 6 months off if I can between gigs. And after my .com decade with Net-a-Porter, I took 6 months off, and it had been such an amazing experience, but also such a stressful experience, and 80-hour weeks and traveling the world and, triple digit year-over-year hyper growth, all of the good things, everything that you could want. And we went through 3 rounds of M&A, and we sold the company and all the good things. And during that 6 months off, I didn't know that any other recruiting gig could surpass what happened during that decade with Net-a-Porter. And so because I had money from the sale of the company, I was like, do I retrain as a chef, which is one of my personal passions, or do I retrain as a pilot? But I was already getting a bit old to retrain as a pilot. And it would have cost, British Airways used to do, I think they still do, every 5 years or so.
Retrain as a pilot would have been a great story.
It would have been a great story, but they run this scheme where they train pilots, but you have to put in $500,000 of your own money, which I could have done with the Net-a-Porter money, but it would have wiped me out. And so I didn't. But anyway, that's been a regret. I could have trained as a pilot and a chef, and then I could have flown around on private jets. But instead, I work with spreadsheets. So,
and occasionally good augmented writing tools, and occasionally Workday. You work with much more than spreadsheets.
Mainly spreadsheets to pay for everything else that you mentioned.
Well, thank you for that, Dave. For everyone here, my name is Amit Bhatia. I am the CEO and co-founder of Data People. We're a recruiting intelligence company, and one of the things we do is help you improve your intake process. More about us later. Today, I want to talk about what I think is the single most critical part of hiring, where the decisions being made in the intake, in the kickoff meeting, the partnership meeting, whatever you call it, echo through the rest of the process, echo through the success of your talent organization in general. And how do we get, every company does it, but I'm sad to say that it's really hard to do right. And so I wanted to talk to somebody who has done it right over and over again, and not just done it right, but done it at scale. And so that's why we have James today. And so we're going to keep this as interactive as possible. We're in a dynamic environment. All of you are grappling with some of the most interesting pieces in talent acquisition. So keep the questions coming in, keep the observations coming in, share about it. And then I want to take that to the first part of the conversation. I think the single hardest thing that we deal with is hiring managers. It actually reminds me of a joke in recruiting. I'm going to ask James if you've heard this one before. How many recruiters does it take to screw in a light bulb?
I haven't heard this before.
Well, it depends. Is the hiring manager going to help this time or not?
That's
That's the problem. That is the problem in recruiting. And so my question to all of you in the audience, and I'd love you today, is the hiring manager-TA relationship at your org truly a partnership? Do you feel like it's truly a partnership? And if it's yes, tell us why. If it's no, tell us why. Because I feel like we're all grappling with the same thing. The difficult hiring manager, the difficult business unit, sometimes it's sales, sometimes it's engineering, sometimes it's go-to-market. And how do we reframe the dialogue as recruiters and talent acquisition as the experts in the room that are collaborating with the hiring managers to build a wonderful partnership that results in a successful hire? And how do we do that effectively? So my first question to you, James, I'm sure when you started at Levi's or Nike or any of the companies you worked at, which are incredible, you probably saw symptoms of the relationship not being a true partnership, in at least in some areas, in some geographies, in some business units. What do those symptoms look like? Like, how do you figure out, whoops, this is not going the way it should be going. Like, I'm hearing anecdotes of frustration. What is the first sort of symptom you hear that this is an improvement area?
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't even need to be endemic across the organization. It can be pockets within recruiting orgs that are serving, to your point, certain geographies or certain verticals within the organization, or it can be, at its worst, it can be organization wide. And I think for me, when you know that the recruiting engine is not working as it should, is when the recruiting team feel like transactional order takers. Because at its worst, that's what recruiting used to be, right? 20 years ago, we were shuffling resumes, shuffling CVs. And, even today, when it's not working, that's how it feels. And that's how we're viewed, that people lob over a job description that's 10 years old. And then we go and do something with it for 30 days. And then maybe we have a meeting and then maybe something happens and maybe it doesn't. And that still happens, right? When the relationship has broken down, or when recruiters don't feel empowered, or when hiring managers don't value the service. And sometimes it's because they don't value TA. Sometimes it's because they don't value HR. Sometimes it's because they hate their jobs. There's going to be a range of reasons.
But one of the problems I feel like that's especially acute in TA is when you're dealing with hiring managers that are much more experienced, there's a power differential, there's often an age differential between the recruiter and the talent, there's an experience and technical differential. But so the TA team is often expected to be immensely deferential to senior engineering leader and all of the technical knowledge and prowess that you bring. But there's not a symmetry. Why are we not equally differential to TA about you're in the market day in and day out, hiring talent, talking to candidates, and we're in a global labor market that's truly distributed. Why do you think that respect isn't always shared?
That's a really good point. And actually, I keep this on my desk because it's my favorite business book. I give it to whenever I join a team, I give it to all of my direct reports. It's the new gold standard, and it's about how the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company, how they create incredible guest experiences. Now, what does that have to do with recruiting? What I love about this book is that it's all about creating a customer-centric mindset in an environment where there is that potential power dynamic. Frontline staff working in hotels, often earning hourly wages, have to be able to provide exceptional service to incredibly wealthy people that may have biased views to the people that are serving them. And it's from small things like all of the staff at Ritz-Carlton are called the ladies and gentlemen of the Ritz-Carlton, and it's small framings like that help set up any employee, whether it's the general manager of the hotel or whether it's a porter, to feel empowered to be on an equal playing field with the guests that they're serving, but also crucially feel empowered to create exceptionally positive experiences for those guests. The lifetime value of a Ritz-Carlton guest can be more than $1 million. And so every interaction has to be perfect. And what I really try and do in my teams is instill that customer-centric mindset. And we have a lot of customers, right? The candidates are our customers, our hiring managers are our customers, our HR business partners are our customers, our compensation partners are our customers. But how we go into those interactions and how we view the outcomes of those interactions can be transformational in how we're positioned.
That's fantastic. And tell us again the name of the book, James, because I think that was something that people are going to want to read.
The
The
new
New
gold
Gold
standard.
Standard. Someone on our team will link to that book right now on the chat so everyone has it. The New Gold Standard. That's fascinating.
I should have told you about
And
this
it's
before. You can tell we didn't rehearse this.
I really love also one of the things that I think is really interesting is really thoughtful. There's so many books written in TA, and you can like name them. There's so many great talent books, but some of the best lessons are truly interdisciplinary, right? What I love about this recommendation, it's like how do we take TA practices from one of the world's best customer service organizations or the world's best brands, and like one of the books that I think informed my view to TA the most was the Nike autobiography, Shoe Dog, and you've lived that front and center. But I was just fascinated by how much empowerment can exist at an organization, and how do you ultimately, this is a story of empowerment, isn't it? Part of our problem with the way TA doesn't get the respect that they need and they deserve to be effective is fundamentally a lack of autonomy and empowerment. Partially comes into a lack of investment in that area. And so that's a really, really important piece. So Ed says, I feel his TA organization works really well, and it's because the commitment that leaders within the org are routinely and consistently encouraged to do. And so I'm kind of curious about that. So at the TA leader level, James, you come in and you've got hiring managers in a certain area that are maybe a little bit more difficult. Often, sales is often a culprit here. Engineering can be a culprit for some organizations. What is your mode of operation? Like, are you sitting down with the leaders of those business units and resetting your SLAs, resetting the expectations? Do you even have SLAs? Do you insist on SLAs as a recruiting leader in a large organization?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer like a lawyer and say it depends. And so the first place I always go is the data. And depending on the organization, we might have really good data or pretty patchy data. But even when the data is bad, we can still get high level directional indications of what's happening. So, looking at the health of the full funnel and looking at time in stage at a minimum,
yeah.
and seeing is what we're seeing in this funnel for this business unit, is that atypical for the broader parameters of our organization? Is it within our stated SLAs? And so first of all, understanding what kind of job are we doing, and is there a problem? Because sometimes there is a problem on our side of the house, and sometimes when I look at the data, it's all looking really positive, but there still is a problem. And then that's telling me, okay, so it's not necessarily an issue with the actual delivery of the recruiting engine. It's how that service delivery is being viewed. And then it's a case of trying to understand what are the stories we're telling ourselves about this service and why. Because
that's right.
There are often underlying causes, and sometimes it's grounded in fact, and sometimes it's grounded in misunderstandings. And it's my job to tease that out, right?
I really like that. That's a great point. It's what is grounded in fact, what is not grounded in fact, having almost like a discovery call, like a sales discovery call, but you're really getting to the bottom of this. One of the tips that I heard from another sort of professional that I really respect was making those SLAs symmetrical. So too often we go in and say, recruiting will deliver you these many, your SLA is recruiting is going to try to get a time to fill of X days or try to get you these many candidates within Y days. And there's got to be a little bit of an SLA on what are our expectations for the hiring manager coming out of these relationships. You're going to be able to create time in your calendar in X time. Or a business unit, you're going to be responsible for delivering not only a interview panel, but a diverse and representative interview panel. Because how are we going to meet our goals otherwise? Or even something as strong as, you're going to help me on a sourcing sprint. We're going to work together for 2 weeks on a sourcing sprint. Have you seen those types of reverse SLAs be effective and work well?
Absolutely. And that's why understanding time in every stage is so critical, because oftentimes the biggest contributing factor to the overall time to fill in aggregate is the time spent in hiring manager review or the time spent waiting for hiring manager feedback. And yes, we have to hold each other accountable on SLAs on both sides of the house, because TA sounds like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but TA is a little bit transactional. And what I mean by that is that there is a back and forth. We're passing the baton back and forth. And for it to be effective, we have to be shuttling that baton back and forth in a timely manner, in a manner that we agreed on. Because otherwise, we're going to be building resentment on either side, which is bad and toxic. But worse than that, we're just eroding our competitive advantage, in that the outcomes of all of that bad process and bad relationship is that we're slow and ineffective at hiring, and then we lose the war for talent.
That's exactly right. So Tasha makes a really great point. Tasha, by the way, one of our customers and a webinar panelist with us. So Tasha, hey, thank you for the awesome questions. She brings up a really good point, that it's about, you got to be empathetic. Sometimes the difficult hiring managers, they are struggling and feeling the pressure. And James, you've seen this too. Oftentimes it's like often a first-time manager or somebody who's already in a really difficult scenario, and they're part of the organization and struggling as a whole. How do you show empathy? Because you're getting into the hiring intake process and it doesn't feel like they're holding up their end of the bargain. They're not really driving it. Part of the partnership is us being empathetic.
1,000,000%. And there, to your point, there can be a range of issues for why it's not working. I firmly believe that hiring is a team sport, and we've got to build team spirit for that team sport to work well. And everywhere that I work, I really double down on that HR, business partnering, and TA relationship. We go into intake meetings together, and we are a team to support the hiring manager, but we're also a team to help manage the hiring manager, whether it's an inexperienced hiring manager that needs coaching. That can come from it can come from the recruiter, it can come from the HR business partner, but also to help identify where there are problems with the hiring manager, and sometimes there are issues, and it's good that HR can see them firsthand.
I like that point. And I think that's a really actionable tip that I want to put up big, is your hiring intake process often needs to have, if not directly in the room, but having close access to the HR business partner. They are the glue in your organization.
1,000,000%. And the way we used to codify it at Levi's was by band. And think about it in the RACI matrix: responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. A lot of the time, it's just it's just the informed, right? And so what that means in practice is that when the recruiter is scheduling the intake meeting, the HR business partner is copied on the invite, and it is optional for them to attend. And HR business partners will attend if it's a junior hiring manager, or if they know that it's a difficult hiring manager, difficult quote unquote, for the range of reasons it can be. And then at director and above, it's mandatory for the HR business partner to attend, and it's mandatory for compensation partner to attend as well. Because really, when you get director and above and you're looking at the 3-part compensation, well, in corporate America, looking at the 3-part compensation, it really is a team sport. And you need everybody there to ensure that it's a really solid intake, and so that we're not getting into issues 3 weeks in, 6 weeks in, that we could have prevented during the intake.
I love that. That is, and I like the very specific. Have them as optional in every intake, so they know it's happening. Have them as mandatory on Director Plus. Have them mandatory for like more junior first-time managers. This is you started to get into the beginning of how do you standardize these processes. This is perfect. And HR business partners, because they're dealing with these hiring managers on day-to-day, what I'm guessing often happens is they can come proactively to the TA and be like, to Tasha's point, show empathy. This hiring manager is under a lot of duress. They're dealing with a lot of stress right now. This is one of the reasons. And you can bake that context in and create that great partnership. So what a great point. Now, one of the things you told me, James, and we spoke before, was you don't like calling them intake meetings. So what do you like calling them instead? I've heard different terms. I've heard kickoff meeting. What do you like?
I prefer to call them partnership meetings because that's what it is. We're going into this
That's what
as
it
a
is.
partnership, and the implication there is that this is a shared responsibility because it is. There's a lot of things in the process, in the value chain that talent acquisition drive, but a lot of the decisions are made by the hiring manager, and it's a true partnership. And I think we really need to be clear on codifying that, especially when we get into areas of DE and I. So for example, it may be an organizational principle that we always present diverse depending on what we mean by diverse in the organization, diverse slates of candidates. That is the unequivocally the recruiter's responsibility to ensure that we're presenting diverse slates of candidates. But that's really where our power in the process stops. If we're consistently presenting diverse slates of candidates, but the hiring manager is consistently hiring straight white men, well, that shows a breakdown in the shared responsibility of meeting the organization's diversity goals, whatever they may be.
That's
and
right.
It's really crucial that we call that this is a shared responsibility. We can't 6 months later say, well, TA didn't hire as any diverse people. So, well, TA doesn't make hiring decisions. TA fuels the process. You make the hiring decisions. And if you consistently make hiring decisions that are contrary to the goals that we've stated, well, that's a different conversation that we need to have now.
I love it.
We're having a poll.
And so
we're having a poll. What's happening?
We're going to have a poll on what are the kinds of intake meeting challenges people have. So because what we would now, the next topic we should get into is how do we now structure that intake meeting for maximum efficiency, for maximum support and maximum partnership. So let's learn a little bit about what our audience is feeling in terms of the challenges that they're facing in these intake meetings. And we're starting to get into them. Even in some of the questions we're talking about, one of the ways to get it is Cal brings up a great point. The TA team has to actually really be immersed in the business. They have to be true business partners. Because if you have very difficult hiring managers, it's this lack of empathy showing through. They don't feel like you are a partner to them in their business. And so my first question to you on that, James, is going to be like, how do you show that? So, let's say you're meeting the head of engineering and they've got sort of downtime issues, sites going down. It's like they're like not able to be. How does TA show up in this meeting, in a kickoff meeting, and change the conversation by showing empathy for their business problems or showing a real deep understanding of their business problems?
Well, first of all, I firmly believe, and maybe I'm biased because I've been in TA for 20 plus years, that TA are often the closest to the business that they support. They spend far more time with hiring managers than HR business partners do. So oftentimes they are far more aware of how their business functions, what it does well, what its issues are, and what the most pressing concerns are, right? The best TA partners sit in on all of the functional leadership meetings. They're part of the department they support. So they already know all of that. And we're almost like the canary in the coal mine for the HR business partners because we can give early indications of where hiring managers need more support, quote unquote, whatever that more support might look like, because they're junior, because they've got, business issues that they don't have time to solve. So I don't necessarily think it's an issue of knowing their stakeholders and knowing what the issues are. It's what they bring to that meeting and how they show up as a TA professional and being grounded in what am I bringing to this? I understand your business. I understand your challenge. I might understand I might have a depth of technical understanding of what makes a good engineer or what makes a good data scientist or what makes a good merchant.
That's right.
But what I'm a true expert in is what is the external total addressable market? What are the trends in that market? And also what's our internal talent pipeline? Because, we're the bridge between talent management and the business.
And this is actually ties in really well with some of the results we're seeing in the poll. The number one reason people are talking about challenges in their intake meeting is in balancing shareholder expectations. And the number two is defining clear job requirements. And I think in both of those areas, one of the big reasons we struggle with this is at larger and larger the organization, we're doing more navel gazing, where everything is about internal, this is how the job is written internally, this is how the job is titled internally. So how do we create better expectations on responsibilities, create expectations on the role by bringing an external viewpoint into the meeting?
This is my, if this is my one takeaway, that please take this away. I always insist that recruiters take their laptops into the partnership meeting, because I'm a great believer in doing stuff in real time and leveraging the most powerful tools that you have. So whether it's an augmented writing tool to help you arrive at a really strong job description in the meeting in partnership with the HR business partner and with the hiring manager, so they can see it in real time. It's like witchcraft when you literally show them what you're doing in real time and the difference that it makes. And then super powerful, open up LinkedIn Recruiter, and I've got a really good example for this. When you're dealing with any large organization, you're going to get people that have a lot of tenure, which is a really good thing. They know the organization inside out. But what they don't know is what's happening in the external market. And certainly at Levi's, well, everywhere I've worked, but let me give a Levi's example. We had a ton of atypical job titles, and trying to explain that to a hiring manager that's been there for 20 years is really difficult. So when I was living in Brussels, and like Belgium is a small country, there's only 11 million people, but the point still stands. I literally brought up LinkedIn Recruiter and I was like, if we call the job this, there are only 15 people in the entire country that do that job, and they already work here. The title doesn't work. And it was like the light was dawning. But you can do that. Yeah. You can do that for any job in any market. Like in San Francisco, you can be like, okay, if I type in data scientist San Francisco, there's going to be a lot of them. But you can also see that most of them changed jobs within the last year. So they're not in our total addressable market. They just changed jobs. Like whatever point you're trying to prove, using the tools that you have in real time is the strongest tool in your toolbox.
I love the idea of using the tools that you have. And it's especially because if you make this meeting like a note-taking meeting, you don't bring the laptop and you don't bring some of these tools in, the only tool the hiring manager might have to go on is in the ATS. It's like Workday or whatever, which reminds me, yesterday's Halloween. I found the most scary costume to be dressing up as a create rec process in Workday, spooking all the hiring managers. Like nothing frightens them more. But how do you? So I really like this idea: bring the advanced tools, make it into a true working session, and force them to think about the external data sets, force them to think about LinkedIn, force them to think about augmented writing, and how we can make those jobs inclusive. One of the big tensions in the intake process is speed. There's almost always a disconnect between a hiring manager who is like, I need this job filled in like 6 weeks or 30 days or something ridiculous. And I think that sometimes when we're in the talent professional is in the room, there's this pressure to be like, okay, I'll try my best. Instead of reframing the question to be, here's the trade-off. You want a data scientist in 30 days? That's hard. But what if this was an analyst role and not a data scientist role? What if this role was framed differently? Like, we act as if our time is not as valuable when we just acquiesce to a demand of do this faster, do more, bring more candidates. But we've got to, instead of talking about what's the trade-off? And the trade-offs allow us to show our expertise in the room, to talk about the labor market. Or the trade-off might be, let's not look in San Francisco. Let's look in Austin, Texas. Let's look in other geographies. We're in a distributed world. How have you grappled, how do you train your recruiters to kind of do this and do this better?
I call it the TA triangle. You've got quality, you've got speed, and you've got time. And you can have two, but you can't have three. So if you want high quality and you want it to be really fast, then it's going to cost money. But if you want it to be cheap, then it either can't be a high quality service or it can't be quick. And there is no way around it. We're not magicians. And I hold really firm on this. We are not magicians. We have finite resources internally and externally to meet this need. And we can deploy those resources however you want. But there has to be a trade-off. And we have to be realistic about the total addressable market. How many people are potentially can we reach, whether it's locally, internationally, whatever our configuration of offices is. What is our positioning in the market? Are we attractive for that specific skill set? And can we afford it? And sometimes we have to have really hard discussions that what you want, hiring manager, we as an organization, we're not in that space. We're not attractive enough, or we don't pay enough. So they're going to have to be some trade-offs. And it's having those discussions that are the hardest. And that takes practice at being able to have those peer-to-peer tough conversations.
I feel like the person matching you on the codability framework is Ed, who just said champagne taste, hard seltzer budget. Like, right, yeah. That's a great point, Ed. Like, but the TA triangle, I always want to make a chart made for every TA professional out there. The TA triangle, this is the core of it. You don't have to just agree, you have to force a discussion on trade-off. So I want to talk a little bit about trade-offs. And with that, I just want to show a little bit of data that we've been working on at Data People on where some of those trade-offs happen. So my question for all of you, let me just share my screen again, is your recruiting process truly impeding your efficiency? And the reason I ask this is, one of the metrics we don't track as organizations is the success of our requisitions. We put recs out there, but we don't actually track how many recs actually result in the hire. Ideally, we want to have 80, 90% result in the hire, but the truth is 1 in 3 jobs, 33% of the jobs don't result in a hire. Not only is this a problem, but on average, we spend 20 more days on the recs that don't result in a hire than the ones that do. And I would argue that at least half or not more of this problem, this sucks up so much of your bandwidth. It sucks up your team bandwidth. It means agency spend goes up. It makes every metric look bad. And I would argue that a vast majority of this comes down to a poorly thought through intake process, a poorly articulated and standardized intake process. Maybe the hiring manager is junior. Maybe we haven't really understood the role. Maybe we haven't considered locations. And this creates a problem. There's a second downstream problem, which is drop-off are starting to occur more and more at later stages. And one of the problems is we are in a distributed world. You're no longer competing with just San Francisco companies, New York companies. You're competing with every company on the planet. And candidates, even in a labor market you might think is more candidate-friendly, employer-friendly, candidates still have choices later in the funnel. And so what's happening is we're seeing consistently drop-offs are happening more, they're happening later, and that is a huge frustration point for startups and for companies. And that can be resolved through better. So my first question for you, James, and for the audience is, does this data surprise you?
No, not at all. Something we instituted at Levi was what we called 90-day escalation meetings, in that when any job got to be open 90 days, we would have a meeting with the hiring manager, the recruiter, the HR business partner. And in the early days, it was me. And then I had to stop it because it was too many. And you're right, every single one of those 90-day escalation meetings I sat in was because it was issues that we should have solved in the intake conversation. You know, we had That's unrealistic expectations either of the total addressable market or the type of person we were trying to buy for the budget that we didn't have. And we could have solved that 90 days ago.
And Andrea asked an excellent question on this specific point, which is, do you find that being brutally honest is better than walking on eggshells when discussing the TA triangle or trade-offs with the hiring manager? And she's asking, how do you have these hard conversations? I want to kind of imagine me, business unit leader, like just refusing to kind of have and engage with you in good faith sometimes. And that happens a lot. Under whatever pressure, like where do you like is this a how do you dance around this? Or are you, how direct are you gonna can you be?
I mean, I'm pretty direct, but it depends who I'm dealing with, and it's also about how do I make it make sense to them, and that TA triangle. It for anyone that's worked in a project management or a software development, it makes sense to them, and I think that's why it's so powerful because it's not just applicable to TA; it's applicable to anything really, and it's about how can you make them understand that what you do, how do you translate that to whatever their business unit is, and it it's either in that framing it like it's a project, resources,
Yeah,
time, and quality, or going back to the data. You can, you know, one of the reasons I've stayed in TA so long is that you can put a number on almost anything that we do, and that always makes for really powerful conversations because we can show total addressable market, the net activity in that market, in that geo. We can show average, whatever it is, we can show the hiring manager, this is the trend in the industry, or this is the trend in the
that's right.
geography. And this is where we are. And
That's right.
we're not magicians. We cannot make this match this. So something has to change.
That's right. It's and I think the directness matters here. And the directness matters, but with empathy. And so it's this you've what I love in sort of where you approach it is that balance between we're direct about the problem and maybe the failures of us as an organization. Maybe we are not perceived as the most technical organization, but we can't go after the most technical people. So that's okay. This is what we need to do differently. But it's still blended in with empathy. That's huge. Now, for the next 10, 15 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about DE&I. I think the intake process is actually, we're all grappling with as professionals as to how do we build more diversity and representation in our talent pipelines? How do we actually get more outcomes? And I think the intake process is probably one of the single biggest things we could do to, improving the intake process can drive that. And you've seen this, and this is something that, you've been a big advocate for and a big ally for. How do you think, where do you think are the number one mistakes that happen when we talk about DE&I in an intake room, in a kickoff room?
The mistakes happen before we even get to that room, right? So, the old adage, what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. That is truer than ever for DEI. And so, first of all, we need to understand what is the organizational philosophy. And by that, I mean, which dimensions of diversity matter to us. And so a great example is that at Levi's, in addition to all the federally mandated dimensions of diversity, Levi's also measured LGBTQ folks. And my most recent employer that legally I can't name, but they make sneakers, they choose not to measure that. And, that's an organizational decision, but we need to be super clear as an organization, which dimensions of diversity matter to us as an organization. Yeah. Then we need to understand where do we currently stand with those dimensions of diversity? And then what is our philosophy? Are we aiming to get to representative levels nationwide? Are we aiming to get to representative levels worldwide? Are we aiming to get to representative levels just within the communities in which we operate? And again, choices That's within right. the organization. Then we need to understand the delta. And then what are we going to do to get there? And then once we know all of that, then it comes down to the total addressable market. So let's do software engineering. 51% of Americans are female, but only 20% of software engineers are female. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to get to 51% to really lead the way, to represent society? Or are we going to accept that 20 is good enough for us?
Yeah.
Because that's what the total addressable market is. And so then when we've got clear goals that we're trying to get to and understand why we're trying to get there, then we need to put in the process that will support those goals. And hiring is only part of that. And even within hiring, as we've already touched on, it's a shared responsibility. We can hold recruiting accountable for presenting diverse slates of candidates if we allow the time for that to happen, because it's going to take longer, especially in rarer skill sets like software engineering, and we provide them the tools and resources to do it. But it only makes sense to do that if we're going to have that commitment to DEI through the value chain. And what I mean by that is that there is unequivocal research from Harvard that even with diverse slates of candidates, if your panel of decision makers is not diverse, then you might as well not bother, because whatever the makeup of the panel is, they will end up hiring more of the same. And so
not to mention actually, like, that also makes a huge difference in convincing when you're trying to bring on really great candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. You also want to, it's a competitive market. You want to, part of your interview process is about selling them on your organization. And if you're only showing them a very homogeneous interview panel, that you're not doing yourself any favors.
Yeah, well, you're literally just going to perpetuate what you already have. Like,
exactly.
Unequivocally, the research shows that. And guess what? When you look at the makeup of organizations, it also shows that, right?
Exactly.
So you have to have commitment through that, which also means making tough decisions, right? Like, we might have to take the power away from hiring managers to say, you don't get to pick your panel. We're going to pick your panel for you, because we have to make sure that your panel is as diverse as the slate of candidates to get the outcomes that we want. And then we also have to make sure that if we are then hiring more of whatever it is, more women, more LGBTQ folks, more people of color, that we're also making it a welcoming environment for when those people arrive. Because if we don't, we might as well not bother doing any of that.
Yeah. But I actually think that, like, so, a few folks say, DE&I is assumed, or we can actually kind of do it. But I think it's about also being very explicit about it. So, like, an explicit thing we can decide at the intake process is if we're aiming towards a bare minimum of representation, then we're not going to rush into interviews until we see 25, 30% women at least at the top of the funnel for an engineering role that's in line with representation. Too often, I feel like we're like, oh, we're going to do an interview panel that's diverse. We're going to make these goals, commitments to diversity, but then halfway through the process, we're going to throw it out of the window and just start interviewing and start trying to run the process, even if the candidate pool, this slate, isn't diverse. And the hiring manager is often the one pushing for that. And that's where recruiters have to be like, nope, we agreed to this. We agreed to what are the conditions for robustness.
And that's where it can't fall on recruiting. That's where it's a shared responsibility, and it has to come.
It's a shared responsibility.
It has to come from leadership, and I mean the C-suite. That's what the escalation has to be. Is if we have agreed as an organization, this is what we're going to do, and then now when we get where the rubber meets the road, we don't want to do that anymore. We can't be talking about it peer to peer. It's like it has to come from the C-suite.
That's exactly right. So I want to actually present some data on this, because there is one way in which that systematically hurts DE&I goals, and this has a huge impact in the intake process, and it's how you scope your job. So you have a few levers at your disposal. One of the things we see hiring managers systematically do is they often overqualify a job. They'll ask for an MBA when they don't need one, a PhD, more years of experience than you need. And this is where the talent partner is the external market expert. But when you overqualify a job, you trigger the confidence gap. And it means invariably fewer people of underrepresented backgrounds tend to apply, fewer of them make it through the process. Everyone does a disservice. And so we did our own research on this, and we looked at this and said, when hiring managers ask for preferred requirements, what do we see? And we see they get 25 fewer candidates, but they get 40% fewer women applying. Not only that, it actually results in 40% fewer qualified applicants. So your candidate pool gets worse when you start throwing in a bunch of preferred requirements. And this trade-off isn't always clear to hiring managers. They don't often look at the data. They think, oh, I'm getting all these underqualified applicants. And in this market, maybe you are. So let's just kind of bulk up the requirements section. But what you're invariably doing is actually shrinking the pool even more, having thoughtful applicants depart your process voluntarily, and really hurting the diversity of the funnel. And just it makes the recruiter's job so much harder, because now we've got to go source all those candidates to try to come up with a representative candidate slate. I'm curious if in the audience, people, we've been asking folks, is DE&I a systematic focus in the kickoff meeting, and we're starting to kind of get to that. But it's one thing to say DE&I is a focus or it's a checkbox, but it feels like we need to actually explicate and I like, James, what you sort of talked about, is explicate the interview panel commitment, explicate the JD commitment, explicate maybe a score that comes from augmented, right? All of these, like, not just having DE&I as a checkbox, but actually talking about how does DE&I show up in the recruiting process.
Look, these are really, really complex and nuanced issues, and I really believe it takes a concerted effort across the organization to educate folks and to change hearts and minds. And I don't think it's fair to expect recruiters to bear the sole burden of educating a cis white male on structural and systematic inequality as a result of requiring college degrees. Like, most people don't get that. And it's not on a recruiter to have to explain that. It shouldn't, and unfortunately it so often is, but it's much more complex and nuanced than that. And it has to be wholesale organizational change, otherwise it's doomed to failure. And the emotional labor that is required, because it's often a confrontational conversation as well. And it's just not fair. It's just not fair that we have to bear that.
I really appreciate you saying that, because that's right. It is not fair. It is a lot of emotional labor. You're asking, and sometimes it's to an older hiring manager. Sometimes it's like akin to calling them racist or akin to calling them prejudiced, and they take it personally, and it ends up with a very unproductive. And there has to be more systematic change that has to happen at these organizations. And as a TL leader, are you partnering very closely with DE&I leaders to facilitate a broader conversation on these types of topics, broader education on these types of topics?
And not just DE&I, the C-suite. It has to come from the C-suite. Otherwise, nothing will change.
That's right.
And people feel like it's optional, or people feel like it's like an HR crusade or a TA, and it's just not productive in these highly polarized times that we're living in. Asking for something as crucial as this, if it truly is crucial to the organization, has to come out of the mouth of the CEO, not out of the mouth of a recruiter.
That's exactly right. And I'm really glad you say it. And like, CEOs do themselves a disservice by saying, "Oh, DEI is really important to us," but then prioritizing referrals or prioritizing speed. And so it has to be a culture that's consistently committed to this. And I really appreciate you saying that. This is a conversation. And what we can do as talent professionals is empower ourselves, empower our team, and be very clear about what we can and can't do, and be very clear about bringing it up in these meetings, that we need to be partners, but we cannot just be teachers and trainers and do all of this, unpaid labor in the organization to try to change hearts and minds. My last topic that I wanted to get into with the few minutes we have left is, now you've implemented a new intake process. We've standardized it. We've got new forms and new templates. We're having recruiters. We're trained. They're talking about the triangle. They're bringing people in. How do we measure it? How do we know that it's working? What are the symptoms of a well-functioning, well-oiled intake process? And I have some data, but I wanted to share from you, James, also, what do you think? Like, what is your sort of the number one thing you look to see that this process is starting to hum?
I prefer to think about it less as like forms and process, and more around sort of guardrails and behaviors. Like, what are the expectations of how a recruiter is going to show up in the intake? What are the broad strokes of what the intake or the partnership meeting is going to look like? Who gets to be involved in that partnership meeting? The tools that we use within the partnership meeting, and then how do we follow up? And so the things I look for are at the broadest level, are we scheduling the partnership meetings within our SLAs? Are we inviting the right people? And then are we following up in writing, confirming the
That's
critical
right.
path and the key milestones and who is doing what?
That's right.
And then are we delivering against those? And really, the indicators are, is our time in stage where we expect it to be?
That's
Is our
exactly
time to
right.
hire, time to fill? Is that where we expect it to be? Is our
Yeah.
quality of hire where we expect it to be, whether we're measuring that through net promoter score or, 90-day, 180-day promote, whatever. And what is it doing to our cost per hire? Like it's
That's right.
the metrics and the indicators are all the same. They are a symptom of the process going well or not well.
And that makes such a good point, because the symptoms of this going well are like the same metrics that you use to measure your overall recruiting health. And so that's exactly kind of what I was thinking is, if you were to like think about what this is going well, if your process is truly scalable, is it consistent? And not everyone has the massive resources of a Fortune 500 company at their disposal of like the most advanced dashboards. But I would distill into, if you can have three really good dashboards: a dashboard that shows you consistency. So your job's consistent, are they inclusive? Like it's not a perfect indicator, but it's where smoke where there's fire. If you're seeing a department where consistency is a problem, it means process isn't getting standardized. And that means that chances are that area needs attention. And almost every organization has a process like that. The second is, are your candidate pools robust? And you talked about this, whether it's quality of hire, whether it's sort of diverse. One of the things I like to look at is two metrics. What is your pass-through rate? And systematically, is it healthy? And what is the diversity pass-through rate? I think we fixate when we look at, are we getting women or underrepresented candidates at the top of the funnel? But one of the things that I like to also look at is, are they moving through the funnel? Are they actually like pulling through? Are we effective? Because that's the sign of a really good process and a very well-designed process. And the final sort of set of metrics is, which you talked about, is the time to fill, time to hire. Are the key process metrics help? And oftentimes, one of the things that we see is when companies are having poor or difficult intake processes, the time to hire may still be good, but the time to fill might start to increase because it's taking a lot longer to even get alignment of the rec up front and to sort of get going. And that's time that talent professionals can't afford to lose. That is, any other metrics that all of you are measuring, I'd love to hear them in the chat that you're sort of looking at and you're thinking about, and you have all the access to metrics like these. Because sometimes it's hard to get access to really good, robust dashboards, really good, robust metrics. And that's why, I guess, Jim, you started this conversation saying you spend all of your time in spreadsheets. And I'm guessing that's why, because metrics are key. Metrics are everything.
And because often HR tech stacks are Frankenstein together with all different kinds of legacy technology. So the only way to bring it all together is in Excel or in Tableau, right?
It is insane. One of the other webinars we ran for folks was, I think there's too many metrics in TA, if I'm being honest. And I actually think that we really need to centralize around 4 or 5 metrics that matter to you. And I think in 2023, we came up with 5 metrics we think matter for you. And so I'll point folks to it in the chat afterwards. But it's really like analysis paralysis is the worst thing we can be stuck in right now, is looking at way too many metrics. James, this has been such an incredible conversation. I just wanted to spend I'm going to allow folks to ask questions and leave comments in the chat for 5 minutes. I want to just talk for 5 minutes just about what Data People does, how we help, and how we could potentially help you. So the last piece here, just Data People, we are a comprehensive platform for hiring fairness and efficiency. We have 2 parts to it: an intelligent editor that companies use in their writing great and inclusive job descriptions. That's something that you take into an intake meeting, use it to align, look at how similar jobs are written at other companies, and really drive a great intake process and actionable insights. So hopefully you have 1 less spreadsheet or 2 less spreadsheets when you're looking at your metrics, because it's spreadsheet hell. And TA folks spend way too much time with spreadsheets and way too little time on the things that they love doing, which is spending time with candidates. And we do this, we've been working very carefully with lots of different types of customers in 80 countries. James used to be a customer of ours. It's just been a really great, fulfilling experience. And we love just thinking about data, thinking about the talent, thinking about how we can really help make the process really collaborative and make the process really fun and effective. That's the end of my sales pitch. The one thing I ask, and I promise all of you, is if you'd like a free audit of your ATS, understanding where the opportunities are, I would love to personally do it. Ping me. I'm going to put my email in the Slack and would love to set up an audit for you. That's it. Last few thoughts, James. I want to stop sharing my screen and just sort of bring it back. We've learned so many actionable tips, and I just want to summarize them for everybody today. And I think a few people did summarize it really well. But the thing that I took away the most in this conversation, there's a few things. The first was bring your laptop to this meeting. It is a working session. Bring technology in, bring an external focus. The second tip that really resonated with me that James brought up was the triangle of success of recruiting, where it is inherently a trade-off between quality, time, and cost. And I would argue that that triangle is becoming a rectangle, where DE&I is a big component of that, right? Where it is a trade-off, and maybe you can pick only 2 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 4, and what do you need to pick? And ideally, DEI is non-negotiable, but if it is non-negotiable, to James's point, that commitment of non-negotiability has to come from the C-suite. We can't just do lip service to an important topic like this. And I think the last thing that really resonated with me was the impact on metrics and really being a data-driven organization. So you're systematically measuring, you're systematically improving. It's almost like Kanban, and Six Sigma, making incremental improvements every day. You've been a great audience, James. You've been an incredible host. So many quotable speeches and so many great book recommendations. Any last words?
You're so welcome. And I just published my first piece on Forbes this morning. I put the link in the chat. So I'd love it if you could all check it out. Let me know what you think. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always open to feedback. But my new side hustle is writing stuff on Forbes. So check it out.
And James is an incredible writer. So I do hope you all check it out. And also check out some of the pieces he writes on LinkedIn, which are phenomenal.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll see you next time.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you all soon. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Bye.